Well, good afternoon, and I appreciate all of you being here. There's a television commercial right now where the guy says, some people call me a control freak. I prefer to think of myself as a control enthusiast. Well, I am not a degreed archaeologist, but I have had a lifetime fascination with all this and enthusiasm. I think it would just be inappropriate to just start talking about the artifacts, the rocks, without acknowledging the size and the culture of the Native Americans and the accomplishments that they achieved that have radically changed the course of human history. If you'll bear with me a few minutes on this, I've kind of tried to break them down into sort of like topics or areas of study that you guys might be undertaking. And the what's called the dismal science, business and economics. Prior to Columbus returning from the New World, and we often hear the phrase Columbus discovered America. Nah, Columbus didn't discover America. He discovered the way home. That was his accomplishment. Other people had been here. They just didn't make it back. But prior to that, the old world, meaning England, Europe, and the land trade and limited sea trade areas that existed at that time, the world had gone to a precious metal economy, but there wasn't really enough to facilitate economic growth. The Spanish came to South America first looking for gold and silver. Now, obviously, the natives did not put the gold and silver in the ground, but they had found it. Particularly in Central and South America, they had made great artistic treasures out of it. They showed it to the Spanish. They showed them how they got it, where to get it, and everything. They were enslaved to remove it, to mine it. Most of the old world, the precious metal that went to the old world was mined by enslaved or nearly enslaved Native Americans. In 1550, the Spanish were well entrenched in Bolivia, a community or town or city. Potosí, I think it is, was also a mountain. From 1550 to 1650, unfathomable amount of precious metals went to Europe, at least 200 tons of gold. Now, when this much precious metal hit the market, it radically changed things. First off, it devalued the current silver market, which was a great economic blow to the old networks that brought it in. But this amount of new currency let the world's economy grow rapidly from that point forward. Likewise, the natives didn't put all the animals, the fur bearers and deer in the country, but they had a long tradition of trapping, processing furs and hides, and extensive trade networks. Well, the English just tapped into this at the Hudson Bay Company. We all learned about in elementary school. It is the first international business and the beginnings of our modern corporate life. As piracy and all these other ills grew, it probably contributed to like the development of insurance and syndicates and stuff like that. The natives had refined a lot of materials from the fields of material sciences. Things that we think of as common today, but the southwestern Indians had learned to cultivate and harvest a guave plant for the sisal fiber, made far superior rope to anything that was, not anything that was there, but anything that was affordable, so to speak. And it also lent itself to making more precise size of rope. In that era, rope was important for agriculture, transportation, shipping, and particularly manufacturing. I'm going to say until probably the early 80s, we were still using sisal twine to bale hay for cattle. Latex rubber. Now, when the latex rubber comes out of the tree, it's a noxious, gummy mess. But the natives in South America had figured out a vulcanizing process. Rubber just became involved in pretty much every product, and it also set the model for synthetics. Cotton. If there is ever a plant that has altered man's history, it's the cotton plant. Now, in the old world, they had a cotton plant, but it produced a short and brittle fiber. It was not a practical plant. The New World cotton was a huge improvement, and the plant from the Caribbean was even better. Now, I don't think that the natives walked around the corner one day and here is a cotton plant in full boll production. The Native Americans from all ends of the continents were plant scientists. And they had domesticated this plant and coaxed it along to what we think of as cotton. Cotton is a member of the Same thing with the tropical hibiscus plant. There's a swamp mallow that grows down close to the coast. That's a gorgeous plant. Somewhere someone noticed the fibers, and they started selectively breeding it, and we have what today we call the cotton plant. Cotton caused a lot of ills. It brought about the increase of the slavery, slave trade, but it also brought about the invention of the cotton gin, and that opened the door to a lot more mechanization throughout the whole world as it was trying to emerge into the world that we know today. The natives also had a superior dye technology. They could make a comfortable t-shirt and they could make it pretty. They also had refined and developed the tobacco plant. Now, if I could just give you one little quick anecdote. My maternal grandfather grew tobacco, and I want to say in the late 50s and early 60s while I was still in elementary school. And I read a passage of how the colonists were struggling. They couldn't make it work. The Indians showed them how to do it. And it had to do with, you have to plant it in a seed bed, kind of pamper it. And then when you plant it in your crop area, you have to, they call it cropping it. You have to go pull the suckers and keep it to one stalk and stuff like that. This is exactly what my granddaddy did in the late 50s, maybe early 60s, growing tobacco. In the field of medicine, I've been a little bit limited on the words that I could pronounce here, but the old world, particularly in Europe, there was a lot of witchcraft and alchemy. At the time the Europeans got here, eye, mute, hair, toe, that kind of stuff. Now, Africa and Asia had different traditions. The Europeans had some plant-based remedies, but the botanical pharmacy or pharmacology of the Native Americans was far superior. At the time Columbus got here, malaria was killing 2 million people a year in the worldwide and affecting tens of more millions of people. Quinine was the first effective agent to combat the ills of malaria. It is derived from the bark of a tree in South America. There's something called apeca or something like that. It was the first agent that would allow to purge enough to get rid of amoebic and relieve amoebic dysentery. There was a dart poison. I'm going to call it curare. It was a very potent muscle relaxant. It later on found a use in surgery. You can't successfully operate on a human muscle if it's all tensed up. So a minute amount of this drug would cause that muscle to relax and facilitate surgery. The Native Americans in South America made a bulb syringe for ear care out of latex rubber. The North Americans made them out of animal bladders. But this caught on in Europe. This was an immediate fad in Europe. Everybody's cleaning up them ears. The Aztecs in the 1500s probably had the best working knowledge of human anatomy of anybody in the world. They were doing minor brain surgeries to relieve pressures and stuff with obsidian blades. Obsidian is a volcanic glass. It will flake very, very sharp. Our political thinking was greatly influenced. The Europeans were taken with the notion of this wild and free man, affiliated but not subservient. Now, prior to this time, freedom meant that a country was not being dominated by another country. It did not particularly extend to the individual, but the notion of the individual freedom, our inalienable rights, entrenched in our heritage and in our founding documents. The Iroquois nation was the model for our nation of states. The Indians practiced in some of their council meetings an extraordinary decorum. One thing that's just funny to me, when a person spoke before a council, and this was in some of the council, some of the tribes, they were expected to sit down and reflect upon what they had said. And if they wanted to amend or alter anything they said, they could do that without prejudice. Now, could you imagine that happening in one of our political debates or anything like that now? In the building sciences, in Central America, in earthquake zones, we were shown how to build trapezoidal walls instead of straight walls, expanding bases. Their masonry was also rigid but snug but not rigid. They were loose-fitted stones, but snug-fitting. But when the earth shook, it didn't tear loose the masonry joints. In the Great Plains, I think the word is Hogan, the natives would dig a pit, bring up a little circular house, just the roof part out of the dirt. This served as a model for the freestanding sod hut and the sod hut that was kind of built into the edge of a hillside in the Great Plains. Far less expensive, far superior as far as strength and thermal qualities than anything they could have been built out of wood. In the Southwest, there were massive cliff dwellings. It's been said that they were doing the best job of delivering housing and public services to the public. They were in a harsh environment, way up on a cliff. Life had to be organized. It had to be codependent. But they had ways of delivering water and I guess trash services, food, and everything that a culture needs. Cahokia. Is that close on the pronunciation? A huge earthen mound in Ohio, bigger than any of the pyramids in the East, in Egypt and such. A mound, in the short term, is just a big pile of dirt, somewhat pyramidal shaped. Now there were several types. There were the fabulous temple mounds, which were the governmental centers and places of meetings and where the elite lived and all that. And when one culture would fail or a ruler would pass, sometimes they were burnt down, put dirt on top of them, and new built up. So these have given us a great access to dig down and evaluate what was going on there. It is said that the Cahokia Mound was the biggest building in the Americas until the United States built the Pentagon, a big earthen mound. Now there were the huge and elaborate temple mounds. There were burial mounds. There were mounds just to enable lookout or maybe to watch the crops or stuff like that. The roadways, and particularly the eastern part of the United States, survey work had already been done. The natives knew where the mountain passes were, where you could get across the river, the swamps to avoid, maybe where the bad dudes live, whatever. The east was laid out. There were paths. In some accounts, the roadways from foot traffic would be 7 and 8 feet deep through the dirt, where they had for eons made these passages. Language. There are 2,200 words in the English language that are taken from the Indian languages. They are in the scientific and the common language. I made some nonsensical sentences and I started listing words, way too many. But it was the names for what was new to the settlers of animals, plants, wild plants, food and fiber plants, weather phenomenon, types of places, just everything. I mean, there was so many things here that were just brand new to the Europeans. The naming of our country, our beloved Chipola, sweet water from the creek language. Now, just a little side thing. If I understand it right, or what the books generally say is, when the first Spanish explorers got here, the natives of North Florida, the Choctaw, were either wiped out by disease or conflict, but the rest of them left and went, it's assumed, out to Louisiana. Later on, Creek and Cherokee people moved into this area from the East Coast. So we have kind of a dual heritage right here. We have the ancient heritage, and then we have the historic heritages of Native Americans living in this area. Silviculture, the notion of managing a forest. Europe had greatly depleted their forest resource. It was just burned out, used up, and pretty much gone. The Native Americans burnt the woods. Now burning, a controlled burn. It's not a wildfire. You start the fire against the barrier and against the wind, and the fire creeps slowly through the woods that you want to burn off. It protects against wildfire. It improves game habitat. Improves plant species. If everything goes right, it's a lot of fun. two species, the longleaf pine here in the south, was probably altered to be the very fire-resistant species that it is by this burning, because the natives predate the climate and everything that enabled the longleaf to be the dominant tree. It was cut out in the early part of the 1900s, or most of it was. Also on the East Coast, there were massive white pines, straight, strong trees, made better ship masts than anything else. Ship masts were restricted the size and capability of a sailing ship. The English Navy that dominated the world came about because of the mask of the white pines. Now, again, the Indians didn't put those there, but they didn't deplete the species, or the source to begin with, and they had maintained forest management. In a quick summary, the world's economy had been transformed by the knowledge and all the efforts of the Indians to produce the precious metal. We established new business models, introduced new resources, advanced medicine, and influenced our political system, contributed to, to housing issues. Hunting. Hunting was not known to the commoner in Europe. That was reserved to the gentry. Warfare. At that time, European armies were putting on brightly colored uniforms, lining up and slaughtering one another. The Native Americans had the good sense to get behind a tree. But this was one of the main reasons that the Revolutionary Army of the Americas was able to defeat the English, this guerrilla warfare, and it changed the face of warfare for then on. They contributed to our language and shaped our forest. But these all sort of pale. The Native Americans transformed the world's food supply. They absolutely changed the world's food supply. Now, somebody said, well, why are we talking about food? We're supposed to be artifacts. No, this is probably the one greatest contribution that they made to change the world. Prior to Columbus, the old world was very, very dependent on small grains, oats, rye, barley, wheat, and that sort of stuff. They grow in a narrow range of soil and climate conditions. They're hard to grow, hard to harvest, hard to mill, and hard to keep. The potato was the first of the domesticated products that the New World accepted. And when I say potato, I mean our white potatoes and our southern sweet potatoes. The South American Indians, and basically in Peru, where the potato was domesticated, probably had as many as 3,000 varieties. They grew in many more environments. Their yield was at least twice as much. It took a lot less work, and the potato did not foster tooth decay the way that small grains do. The world's population began to grow as soon as the potato hit the old world. Corn. Corn is simply a grass with two unique characteristics. And it has a husk system over multiple grains versus a husk system over individual grains. Corn, well, let me back up. In the small grain that was being grown at that time, you planted one little grain and you got 6, maybe 8 back. And we're still talking about little tiny grains. Corn, even the primitive, what we would call Indian corn at that time, if it made one small ear, you had 75 or more kernels. If it was a good plant, or a good yielding plant, it was several hundred. So we're going from a 1 to 6 return on a little small grain to a 1 to 75 or several hundred return on a larger kernel. Corn also has the unique quality that it has there's more elements in its DNA sequence than in a human. It lends itself to being manipulated. Potatoes and corn and then beans. Now, there was one bean native to the Old World. I don't know if it was palatable or not, but there was only one, and it really wasn't a player. Any other bean you've ever heard of, including my personal favorite, the southern butter bean, was domesticated by the Native Americans. Now, these are staples, and these are plants that are, they grow in a wider range of places. They're easier to grow, easier to harvest, yield better, easier to keep. This changed the world. This really changed the world. Now, to that lineup, we're going to add some more tasty things. Squash, all of our summer and winter squash, pumpkins, and the inedible gourds. The southeastern Indians were particularly adept at the corn agriculture. When the Spanish explorers came through here, and they came through here, they were amazed at the corn production here in North Florida. They also grew a unique combination, corn, beans, and squash. They have each plant has its own benefits to the other plants in that environment. Corn is a grass. It loves nitrogen. Bean is a legume. It fixes nitrogen and also climbs on the corn stalk. The squash shaded the ground, conserved moisture, and prevented erosion. Also, when these foods are consumed together, the human being is much more able to utilize the nutrients that they hold. Tomatoes, peppers, and chilies. Now, the old world had a pepper. It was not so much a culinary thing. It was a slight numbing agent. It was very expensive. The old world had spices, and they were very status thing. Everybody wanted lots of spices on their food, and sometimes spices covered food that was past its prime. But peppers and chilies, the southern peanut. Our peanuts came out of South America. Peanut scientists can go back and tell you when these plants first they hybridized on their own. And then we have taken this plant and brought it along, improved it a great deal. There's other things. Jerusalem artichoke, that's a little tuber. We had to look that up in a book, a plant book. I'm not really familiar with that. From the Caribbean and South America, pineapples, avocados, papayas, cassava, the ingredient of tapioca, the pudding stuff, vanilla, and chocolate came out of South America. The natives tended dozens of varieties of blueberries. Barbecue, Cracker Jack, trail mix, New England clam bake, all your corn dishes, including hush puppies, are all dishes that are in our culture, our culinary culture, that were Indian dishes. And think about the British had no potatoes to go with for their chips, for their fish and chips. The French had no vanilla for their desserts. The curries from India and all the Asian dishes didn't have the peppers. The Italians had no tomatoes for their marinara sauce, and there was no ketchup. 4 quick points. Since Europeans arrived in the Americas, we have not domesticated a single other plant. Now, that doesn't mean that crazy Uncle Joe doesn't go down there in the swamp and eat. I'm talking about something that is, brought to market. We have not domesticated another product. 3/5 of all cropland planted and all foods consumed in the world today come from this list that I've just read out. Now, for you math enthusiasts, 3/5 is more than half. That means more than everybody else put together. So I assume that means that the natives were the world's foremost food plant scientists. Think about that. 3/5 of all the food that the world eats today came from these cultures. Also, think about this a second. What would it have been like if Europeans had gotten to the New World and the Native Americans had not been here? Now, it would have been a great resource. Land and water, and not the same timber, not quite the same wildlife, but all these plants that I've been mentioning here. These were plants that were improved, domesticated, whatever verb you want to use, by the Native Americans. I don't think we have no idea, but would anybody have ever picked up on this little tuber in South America and said, well, what if we take it home and play with it for 3,000 or 4,000 years, see what we can get, or corn, or these other things? The world owes the horticulturists, the agriculturists of the Native American community a great deal of gratitude. To me, the essence of archaeology is trying to interpret what either ancient or sometimes more recent cultures, trying to interpret them by the objects they left behind. It has branched in nowadays into many, many disciplines. Technology has really advanced archaeology. First off is your radiocarbon dating. We now can, you can't take a stone object and radiocarbon date it. But when you find a site that has never been disturbed, and you can evaluate that and radiocarbon date the organic material in context with it, next to it, and not once, you do it, when that happens over and over again and you build a pattern, that's how we can say these points are this old. DNA. DNA has confirmed what we've always thought. The vast majority of Native American DNA is the same as the Mongolian people across the colder part of northern Europe and Asia. There are some little anomalies, but I think that percentage is above 95%. Here in Florida, archaeology began as a science, so to speak, in the early 1900s. There was a gentleman from, I believe it was Maryland. He was a wealthy individual. He was very interested in all this, evidently did a lot of his homework. He outfitted a steamship, and he sailed down the East Coast, particularly the East Coast of Florida, and even more so the Gulf Coast. He was C.W. Moore. He's kind of a beloved and behated figure in the early archaeology. Like I said, he had done his homework. He excavated, plundered, by his own description, destroyed many of the mounds, and a lot of these were burial mounds. And by the way, this is big time against the law nowadays, but it wasn't in the early 1900s. He did, however, maintain meticulous records, and he was meticulous in his preservation. There are objects that were found in this expedition in the early 1900s that are in the Peabody Museum at Harvard, the Smithsonian, the Museum of the American Indian, the University Museum at Philadelphia. Exquisite ceramics. There were ceramics from, anybody here from the Weewa-Hitchcock area? Now that's a fine Irish name for you. Or Fort Walton. At Weewa, where the Chipola River runs into the Apalachicola River, the Indians had dug a canal. I guess there was turbulence or whatever where the two intersected. There were mounds there. Some of that pottery from Gulf County is in the Peabody Museum at Harvard. There was a lot of controversies and hoaxes in early archaeology. And one issue that was quickly resolved here in the state of Florida was, and this is a lot about what we're going to be looking at today, was whether or not early man in the Americas overlapped the now extinct Ice Age mammals, the mastodon, the mammoth, saber-toothed tigers, all these big, generally big late Ice Age mammals. And that has been put to rest many times. As early as 1924 in Melbourne, Florida, they found a Columbian mammoth skeleton with, I believe it was a butchering tool, a flint tool in the rib cage. There have been mastodon bones found with butcher marks on them. In, I think, 81, in the Wasissa River, just east of Tallahassee, they found the remains of a giant bison. Now, this is not the Western Plains buffalo. This is another extinct Ice Age mammal. Had a flint point in his skull. So that's pretty compelling evidence that he overlapped with humans. There is a famous point from that same era when man was overlapping extinct Ice Age mammals called the Simpson Point. It was named for Mr. Clarence Simpson, who lived and worked here in Jackson County. He assembled the largest collection of these points, and we understand it's controlled by the regional DOT office down in Gainesville. Local sites. I can sum those up for you in two words: Jackson County. This whole county was an archaeological site, as was most of North Florida, and most of Florida, but particularly this area. Within walking distance of where we are right now, there are at least 3 very significant archaeological sites. The Florida State Caverns Park and the cave that's open at both ends, the Earth Shelter Cave or Natural Bridge kind of cave. The Chipola River was just a trove of ancient fossils and artifacts. I'll come back to that. Some of the law has changed on that recently. There is cave art fairly close to here that is unique to the southeast. Only 1 of 2 rock arts located in Florida. I went down the list of every town in Jackson County, and I've either found points nearby or have friends that have, or there's stories. I mean, this area was very, very much populated. Let me run by some resources for you, and this is an incomplete list at best, but it's people that I have that are accessible, and you learn to appreciate when these very academically trained people will deal with an amateur, so to speak. The University of West Florida Archaeology Institute over at the University of West Florida, Pensacola. I particularly have enjoyed talking to a young man there named Greg Harding. Now, let me get off subject just a second. They got big news over there. I said earlier, in 1550, the Spanish were well established in Bolivia mining silver, and they were getting after it. But no one had established in the U.S., in what we call America now. They had established in South America. Shortly after 1550, this town, Potosi, would soon rival London and Paris in size because of all this silver mining. It was the world's most productive silver mine, and it's still being mined today by kind of, the mop-up crew, so to speak. But in 1559, the Spanish in Mexico outfitted the Luna expedition. They were going to colonize in the U.S. They brought 6 ships, 500 Spaniards, 200 Aztec warriors, and an undisclosed number of African slaves to Pensacola. On these 6 ships, they were setting up a camp. Within a matter of weeks after they got there, a hurricane hit and sank all 6 of their ships. In 1992 and again in 2006, each one of these ships have been found. Within the last year or so, in probably what's a nice neighborhood in Pensacola, close to the bay, close to these ships, someone had a house bulldozed down to build a new house, but they allowed a local historian to just poke around, and he called in the big boys, and they say that they have a perfect chemical match on the fragments of the olive jars. There's Aztec pottery there's no other explanation for why it's there, plus all the metal stuff they found. So Pensacola's going to be able to argue from now on that although they weren't the first, they were the first established settlement that was established to be a permanent settlement. Unfortunately, it failed. St. Augustine was the first one that was established and survived, but the settlement in Pensacola was the first to be established. The Temple Mountain Museum in Fort Walton is second only to the Smithsonian in their collection of what we call Fort Walton era pottery, which was a late era just before the Europeans got here. It's right there on Highway 98. It's a small city-run museum, but it has a trove of just exquisite pottery and a lot of other stuff. It's a small building, but it's a unique resource. Down in Bruce, Florida, that's a little town west of Ebro on Highway 20. The Muskogee Creek organization has a tribal building there, and they do a lot of genealogy and cemetery work. They're nice people to talk to. Florida State Caverns Park out here was a site, and they have some good displays. In Tallahassee, you've got the Mission St. Louis, recreation of the historic Catholic Spanish missions. You've got the Archaeology Department at Florida State, and all the state archaeologists, and R.A. Gray Building, the State Museum, and the state archives there. I'd be remiss in talking about this if I didn't mention the late Calvin Jones. He was brought to Florida to aid in what to do about the building of the interstate and how to handle all the archaeological spots that were there. But he really made archaeology accessible to people. He kind of turned the tide on the way that professional archaeology, looked at amateurs and broke down some walls and stuff. Also, until recently, there was a gentleman named Lewis Tesser. He was the senior archaeologist for the state of Florida for many years. A good friend of ours, well, actually, his sister worked there, and we got to meet Mr. Tesser and got to take our stuff to see him. And he's just like a kid in a candy store. He'll sit down. He will literally sit down on the floor with you and dump out a box of rocks and talk about them at the day. He brought things to a screeching halt at my store one day. We poured them out on the floor and quit selling furniture. When I would take stone objects that confounded him or puzzled him or something, Mr. Tesser would say, next time you're in Panama City, take this by Tom Dietrich's. Mr. Dietrich is here with us today. He is one of my heroes, and he's going to talk to you a little bit later, and he's got some stuff over at the library that's just amazing. Some of you have heard this line before, though it pains a Seminole to say this. The Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida is a state, regional, and national treasure. It's one of the top museums of natural history in the country. You walk in the door, and there's, I think the mammoth is first, and then the mastodon, and they have a recreation of a Coosa village. They have a recreation of the Florida State Caverns Park. They have a great thing right now on early St. Augustine, the archaeology of St. Augustine. They have, you know, collections. Years ago, we were passing through there, and they were having an open house. They had rooms, it just dwarfed this one, with floor-to-ceiling shelves, Caribbean pottery bigger than basketballs, and just, oh my goodness, it was just blow your mind. But that truly is, and their fossil collection. They have all the prehistoric fossils, an armadillo nearly as big as a Volkswagen bus, a bird big enough to cut you in half, and all these kind of things. It's an amazing display. There's two names there. Gerald Millerlanch, he's written extensively. We have some books in the library that he did, and a lady named Miss Barbara Purdy. She's one of my favorite writers about this subject. Nancy White down at the University of South Florida has done extensive work in the Apalachicola Basin area, and on the web, floridapublicarchaeology.com. Now, who's got the clicker? We're going to try to talk about four things together here. The different periods that we recognize in the most condensed way of looking at prehistory, the four periods of prehistory. The footprint of Florida at the time, just a word or two about that era, and then the changes in the flint technology and the point style. Let me have a click there. This, the yellow here is the, well, let me back up a second. In the Ice Age, most of the world's water was trapped in the polar ice caps. The world was much, much drier. The water table was probably as much as 300 feet lower than it is now. So this yellow perimeter goes back maybe 10,000 years ago. Now we've got stones here that, by all that we can learn, go back that far. Then this pinkish is 8,000 years ago. The green is 6,000. And then the red is the current Florida. And you know, the coastline constantly changes, and we're not talking about that 5 yards or you know, we're talking about major change in coastline. If you'll give me another click. These are 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the four main, now again, condensed down, but these are the four main stages in their evolution of their technology. The first period, the Paleo point, and this goes back 8 to 10,000 years BC. These people were wide-ranging hunter-gatherers. As we've said earlier, they overlapped the last of the Ice Age mammals. But they basically had one style of point, and there's some variation. Click here. Give me one more, Mr. Bryan. This is a Simpson point that was found here in Jackson County of the same era. Now, before I move on, I want you to imagine that maybe somebody just got tired of doing all this fancy work here, or maybe they broke this off here, or maybe they just had a brainstorm one day and said, oh, let's put some notches in this thing, make it easier to tie on. All right, give me a click there, please, sir. This is the Archaic era. and it's considered to have existed from 8,000 BC to 1,000 BC. Now during that time, the shoreline had moved in a little bit, but it's still 100 or more miles out here in what we consider in the Gulf now. These people transitioned from being more territorial hunter-gatherers to permanent camps. They began horticulture, tending of the plants that were there, the fruits or the blueberries or whatever. Probably in the 2000 BC to maybe 1500 BC, they adopted the use of a material called steatite. It's a soft stone that you can make a shallow bowl out of. They also adopted the use of fiber-tempered pottery, the crudest of the pottery types. Probably was the first pottery in the North Americas. We don't know if it was introduced or something they invented. But their stone technology had two stages here. Brian, can I have the next click, please? Now, first off, just kind of disregard the blades. Just think about the notching. We started with side notching. We went to corner notching. This is what we call an exhausted blade. It's been resharpened until it's about used up. Plus, it was a unique sharpening style where they only took material off of one edge. That's the way you sharpen a fillet knife, though, and it's some industrial tools. But we went from side notching, corner notching, and you can almost see the remnants of the corner notching here. But by the time we got to the end of the era, it was a different formed stem, it's called. This probably is the difference between the pre-pottery and the post-pottery, pre-ceramic or ceramic era. Shows up in that era right there. Now, let me jump off subject just a second. Florida State published a magazine, it's been quite a few years ago, but they had been doing research in the Gulf. Now we have this in the library for you to look at. They were, I believe it's 9 miles out, 30 feet of water. They were looking with sonar for rock outcrops. They found one. The first people that lived there was in this early era, and they were harvesting stone there and making tools. They abandoned it. Time passed. The Gulf came in. The second group of people that lived there were living there when that was, the first group, the coastline was probably another 70 or 80 miles out. The second occupation of this particular site was when it was on the coastline. They can tell that by the amount of oyster shells and what else they find there. This is off the Wasissa River, just out east of Tallahassee. All right, click, please, sir. The next period is the woodland period. Now, I'm not going to say that the shoreline was all the way to where the coast is now, but it was moving that way. This was probably 1000 BC to 1000 AD. They were beginning agriculture. By the end of the woodland period, the natives had adopted the bow and arrow. Now we think of the bow and arrow always, but no. Prior to that, the Native Americans used what's called an atlatl. And all primitive cultures used some kind of forearm extending throwing device. The biblical account of David and Goliath, the sling, same principle of physics. You take a stick with a hook on the end of it, you can throw a spear much heavier, much further. It's a deadly weapon. It's far more deadly than a thrown spear. At this era, give me a click there, please, sir. They returned to notching, but this time the notching was on the base, basically notched. Now, I'm kind of vague as to when these points became arrowheads. Brian, if we go to the next screen, please, sir. We come down to the last era of the stone technology, and it's kind of a dinky-looking little point. That was representative of the era when they were using the bow and arrow. I cannot tell you that that's an era point, but this is representative of that era. Now, if you'll kind of notice, it appears that the stonework has gone backwards rather than better. And that's for two reasons. These people had access, because the water table was so much lower, to a far higher quality of material, deeper in the soil. And they were strictly hunter-gatherers. They were dependent on this. These folks were farmers. So the splint tool was not as important to their everyday sustenance. The historic era, that's after Columbus's trips. All you can say is that the Native Americans were not, had not been exposed to all the pathogens in Europe, Asia, and the Old World, everything. They were just devastated. Smallpox, respiratory diseases. I just stumbled onto a lecture on television a few months ago, and this guy, bless his heart, he labored long and hard trying to say that the diseases of smallpox and stuff has probably been somewhat overestimated. And he talked about other things, basically just cultural shock, little things like the Europeans always brought hogs with them, and hogs always get out. And they just ravaged the natives' cropland, plus depreciation of the game resource and just the culture. I mean, the laws of physics have been turned upside down to these people. The air that they breathed would kill you. I mean, we cannot wrap our heads around the cultural shock of when the Europeans got to the New World. Had another group, if Africans had found the New World, or if Asians had found it, I think that the disease issue would have been more or less the same. How other things worked out, we'll never know. And to be quite frank, there's a lot of the history of the United States in regard to our native population is not our proudest moment. Collecting was just always fascinating. When I was a little kid, I mean, every rock we found, we thought it was an arrowhead. I think I lost the first one I found. And the gentleman, Mr. Roy Roberts from down in Sneeds, had worked on the dredge boats. Now, Ms. Hopkins asked me to explain 2 or 3 things through here. After they built Jim Woodruff Dam, when I was a child, there was a great hope that the Apalachicola River system would be the new Mississippi, that would be barge traffic up and down it. So there was 2 things happening. They were dredging to maintain the channel, and they were also dredging to harvest material, basically sand or gravel. And the way this worked, I don't know exactly how, I think it was like a big vacuum, but the material came up on a conveyor belt, and then it fell off. And chert, our flint or rock that these things are made out of, is crystal enough that it'll kind of ring, and the guys learned to hear it when it'd come over. And the artifacts that were recovered from those dredge boats, it was just amazing. When I came back from school, from college in the early 70s, a lot of my friends were beginning to dive the river. Now, we found a few things snorkeling. The scuba divers really, they found amazing things. My sons that are here today, they found a few things. I never really got into the diving, although when we go snorkeling, I always look for a piece of pottery on St. Joe Bay, but never do find one. We surface hunted. Now, all this, the agricultural practices in this area changed in the early 2000s. Prior to that, for weed control, we did what we call deep plowing, breaking land, whatever. The moldboard plow was invented by Thomas Jefferson. It was kind of a concave blade, and you pitch it into the dirt at a little bit of an angle, and it literally dug down and flipped a roll of dirt over. Well, what that did for us was it exposed dirt, exposed deeper dirt, put it on the surface. Now, you go out in a 40-acre field, and the dirt is, the topsoil is going to be maybe 6 to 8 inches, or 20 or 30 inches deep, and you've got that one shot of what might be showing on the surface. So it's a hit and miss process, but we had an opportunity to hunt on family land for a period of about 20 years, from the early 80s to early 2000s, and that's where most of our stuff came from. Ms. Hopkins told me that people had inquired about colors. So Brian, if we could have the next, well, this is some more of the little, this is called the Mississippi era. And the Mississippi era was characterized by the temple mounds, exquisite pottery, and this use of the bow and arrow. Next frame, please, sir. This is the raw material that the points around here are made of. This is called coastal plains chert. It's kind of a lesser grade of flint, and chert and flint are very generic terms. They're not specific formulas, so to speak. However, this material occurs when high calcium limestone has been compressed with sand-bearing clay through eons of time, and you get this semi-translucent, caramel-colored hard, fairly hard, crystallized kind of you wouldn't say glassy, but kind of headed that way. Now these materials have one unique characteristic. They fracture on a plane, on a consistent angle. So once you learn how to do it, you can more or less control your flaking. Now this is they will have imperfections and they'll have knots in them. They don't all flake out, but this was their raw material. Since this is alkaline in nature, it came from limestone, and all the soil in northwest Florida is very acidic. It etches or deteriorates or patinas the surface. Next slide, please, sir. This is 3 what we call modern plow brakes. These were recently broken stones. Next, please. You can see the inside cores are different colors. The outside had deteriorated, etched, or patined is the word, I believe. Frame, please, sir. The next is the river stuff that came out of this is the dredge boat stuff from the Apalachicola River. First off, it's shiny because of the water and sand wear. The dark color comes from the tannic acid in the roots of all trees that grow in the swamp and the river bottom. It keeps the roots from deteriorating. But it's the same stuff, tannic acid, that we tan our leather with. Next frame, please, sir. The pink stuff on the bottom and on the top frame is called heat treated. As the water table came up, they had access to poorer and poorer quality materials. But the natives adopted this or discovered this technique of heat treating, layering stone flakes, their blanks that they were going to work on, in sand, building a really hot fire over them, cooking off some of the organic impurities, hardening it a little bit, but it turned the material pink. Top row. Now, this middle row, the second row down, that's just a lot of points that are what we call exhausted. They'd been sharpened and resharpened. I don't know that any of them were built in that shape, but they were recyclers. This was a valuable resource. They weren't just going to discard it the first time it got dull. They were going to touch it up and go again. There's a few points in their frames over in the library that are probably trade material. I could point a couple of them out to you, but there's just a few of those. Most of our collection came from my maternal grandparents. They were the Sam and Hattie Bennett Messer family from Delwood, Florida, out past Blue Springs. That was a great site for them to live. It had a good water supply. It had what we call karst limestone. Karst. That just means the limestone occurs at the surface so they could get at some of the chert. We have some points found in other similar agricultural spots. I think there's the two frames that have red backing are just points I've acquired over the years, and then of course the dredge boat points and some other river points. 2 things I need to mention. These are what archaeologists would describe as a disturbed site, particularly in a plowed field. That point's been drug up and down the field. It's removed from its context. It's a pretty point to an archaeologist, but it's out of context. It doesn't really tell them anything. Same thing with the river points. But all the river recovery has been done away with. The dredging and the material mining has played out years ago. And in 2005, the river recovery was banned here in the state of Florida. Now, Mr. Dietrich is here with us today, was a premier diver, and I hate it for everybody that did that in a responsible way. But there was too much mechanical harvesting going on, too much damage to the river bottom. However, you could go there today and you could dive and you might find some of these things, and you could remove anything except an Indian artifact. These are considered cultural artifacts. And the river's been picked over a lot, but in its heyday, you might dive down and fan out a bed of gravel and find, you still do this today, shark's teeth. They are millions, tens of millions of years old. They came out of the limestone that formed here when this was covered by a salt sea, and they have eroded out in the rivers. You might find fossil remains of prehistoric, extinct Pleistocene mammals. You might find the points associated with them. You might find more modern points. Unfortunately, you might find a beer can, a flip-flop, or my wife's first wedding band in the river. Now, if there's anything I could say to put our family's collection in context, this is far, and I do repeat, far from the premier collection that's ever come out of Jackson County. The Hub Chasen book about the river stuff, There are collections that have gone to museums. The strength of our collection, in my opinion, is that we save more of what I call site material, the everyday nuts and bolts, the grindstones, the nutting stones, all these things we'll show you pictures of later. We brought it all home and saved it. Again, these were legal recoveries at the time they were done. And the field hunting, they would deep plow, we'd wait for a rain, and you need just 2 or 3 things to hunt. You need a stick, some good shoes, a hat, and some Gatorade. And you're out there in a plowed field and you're just looking for anything that's not dirt, basically. And some years it would just pop up, and some years it just wouldn't show up. It was just a hit and a miss from the plowing, the weather conditions. You know, it was hit and miss, but it was great fun. All right, next frame, please, sir. In the library, I've got the display cabinet there. We're starting top left. And this first assortment is stuff that was not native material to Jackson County. This was all trade items. These are probably all the center columns out of whelk shells, came from one of the bays. Somebody walked down to St. Andrews or back and back. The atlatl, the throwing stick, they would put a weight on it, a balance weight. These are 3 broken atlatl weights. Slate is not native here. The mica is a mineral that's not native here. The steatite is the soft stone that they made bowls out of. Next frame, please, sir. This is a little bit of ochre. We didn't get a good picture of it. It's a brilliant, bright red ochre, and it's pigment, war paint, whatever. It's very fine. It'll just get on things. These 3 little trade pipes belong over here with the river stuff. These are expedient blades. Now, I cannot swear to you that these were used for cutting tools, but most of them would cut you. And they didn't have to have a real finished knife. I mean, you're doing something there, you need to cut one little sinew or something. There's a sharp blade, a sharp flake, cut it. Of course, the river stuff is the dark stuff. Okay, the next frame, please, sir. Again, this is the dark river stuff. It is water-worn, smooth, and stained by the tannin acids in the water. All right, next one. This is just pieces of pottery. But the unique thing about that frame, and this was identified by Mr. Tesser over at the State Archives, they made pottery in North Florida for upwards of 3,000 years, from maybe 2,000, 1,500 BC till after the Spanish got here. Every era of pottery that they made was represented on this one farm. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they lived there all the time, but they came, visited, made pottery, lived there, whatever. This was a spot that was good conditions. They were back and forth, like I said, over 3,000 years of making these different potteries. Now we drop down to the bottom right. Of course, this is the stone that the chert comes out of. These are patined blades, these chalky outside blades. This big stone is a water polish. You can't see the polish here, but this is a big chunk of very dense, heavy sandstone. Excuse me, since it's water polished, it probably came or possibly came from the Apalachicola River. These are river cobbles, polished river stones. They were used as hammer stones and other tools. Most of them you find have got one end that's fractured. They were probably used in making the tools. But like I said, most of them have a fracture on one end. All right, sir? Again, just some more of the points. These are some more of the sandstone tools and shallow grinding bowls and stuff. Next one, please, sir. The rock with a hole in it. Now, this is not native material. This is probably granite or something. It's a dense piece of rock. And the traditional explanation for this is a nutting stone. We did a little program at a library here in this area several years ago, and we had a touch table because these were young children, and I put the nutting stone down, I put some pecans down, and I put a hammerstone. I didn't have to tell anybody what to do. The kids walked up there, put that, da-da-da. Now, it also may have been a small mortar, like a mortar and pestle for grinding something. I don't think this one was a socket for a bow drill, but some of the smaller ones, you could see where they would have just been handy for a socket for a bow drill rather than trying to hold that thing down with your hand. That's just speculation on my part. Nutting stone is traditional explanation. Grindstone with an appropriate size grind rock, although these were found in separate locations. The round rock on the top in the scientific language is known as a knocker rock. Next one, please, sir. All right, this starts the frames. These are generally called the Bolin points. They're called bevel Bolins most of the time because their sharpening technique was to just take material off one side, like I said earlier, like a fillet knife. Now, when you get down to naming points, there's a southern expression, finer than frog hair, split 5 ways and sanded. Now, there is some nuanced differences between these, and we ain't going there. But there's a big sandy complex, and the Bolins are part of it. This is a good representation of Bolins. These came from Jackson County. These points could be as old as 10,000 years old. And if we broke them or cut them, they would all be one of these other materials inside. All right, sir? This is some of the stemmed points. These 2 points, and these are 2 points from Chipley, and or this one's from Chipley, and also this one, but where we live was not particularly a site. But these points probably are representative of the earlier archaic stem point. The longer stem one and this one up here, probably representative of the post-ceramic period of the archaic period. All right, sir? This would be some of the woodland points, the basically notched Hernandos. Now, these little triangular points, we may be drifting into error points here. We don't know exactly what they did with these things, but we're drifting in there. Next frame, please, sir. These are more typical of the Mississippi era, the error points. Can you go back just a second, Brian, one time? The Doyle-only theory. Now, this is just my theory. I think of some of these points as being made out of the tips of other points. You broke a point off, knocked 2 notches in the base, and you could go again. I also, and again, this is just something I speculate about, some of them may have been ancient broken tips that were heat treated and then reworked. All right, next frame, or give me 2 then, please, sir. This frame is tools that were altered for other purposes. Top right, those 2 little, what might have been drills or perforators or something, I found together. So I've always thought that they were part of somebody's toolkit for whether it was whatever it needed. This one here, to me, that means that was very good material because it stood up to constant resharpening, and it's exhausted. There's very little here left. When you process hides, you must scrape all the flesh and fat off the backside. So a scraper was very, very important to their technologies. This is the first point that I found that I didn't lose. When I found it, I took it home and got my mom's Clorox and bleached that sucker white. All right, next frame, please, sir. These are large blades. Now, chances are, we tend to think of things, one purpose. I think that they had to be much more flexible. This may have been a wood cutting tool, an agricultural tool, we don't know what. If it held up to that and to resharpening, it eventually would have been brought down, and if the material was good enough to continue to be used, this may have eventually become a blade or some kind of point. All right, sir? This is a frame of some larger stones. Celts, fancy word for tomahawk head. Greenstone, this is not a native material, and the technique was peck and polish. Maybe you find an oblong piece of this, and you take a hammerstone and you start cracking the edge, just pecking on a little bit, and then you grind it down and you peck on it, and with a lot of hand effort, you could make a real uniform. These were probably not everyday use tools, although I showed this one to a gentleman that was a real accomplished carpenter one time, and he looked at the bevel here, and he said, Doyle said, that's a wood adze. So that was used for some reason for woodworking, and we speculated, well, maybe that's what they made the dugouts for, but there was not that much water there, so we don't know. The steatite bowl at the top, this is my most recent addition. One of my cousins found this out at Delwood, not on our property, but close by. They live pretty much everywhere out there. A rock with a hole in it. All right, next frame picture, please, sir. These are 2 more. This is two cells here that you'll be able to hold over in the library. Next frame, please, sir. It's the same with the small one. Next frame. That's a Native American selfie. Now, a gentleman I know found this in the last year or two. It ain't within walking distance of this campus, but it's here in Jackson County in this immediate area. We thought it was a statue head. We got Mr. Dietrich in to look at it. In the late era, the Fort Walton era, they made exquisite pottery. They made a lot of really big pots, and they did effigies, animal effigies and human effigies for handles, pot lugs. Most likely this is a pot lug from a Fort Walton era pot. I don't know if you can see it here, and it actually shows up better in the sunlight. And this culture was just before the Europeans got here. There's a little pigment up here just above his right eye that you can see that little dark, that's a little bit of red pigment that's still on there. All right, next frame, please, sir. Bison horn, American and buffalo, recovered from the Chipola River. My good friend Mike Bordelon here. Some people think that the buffalo was really a woods animal and adapted to the plains, that originally they were a wood-dwelling animal. I don't know, but next frame, please, sir. Whoops, we're getting into Mr. Dietrich's stuff. So we're going to back off there. I'm going to have Mr. Dietrich come up and finish this up, and I'm going to sit down, and he is going to amend or correct what I've said. But let me say this. Let me say a couple of things to y'all. First off, I appreciate being asked to be here. I've been very impressed with all the students and the demeanor in which you carry yourselves and the way you are so adept at all your digital technologies. Just amazes old guys. Whether or not you pursue this as a career or anything, it's a great interest of history, our area and such. And if there's one thing I can say to you, North Florida is a historical treasure trove. It is a natural world treasure trove. We have, here in Jackson County, is the second most biological diverse county in the state. You go from the coastline, our beaches, our bays, our rivers, our cultivated lands. Get out there and do Florida. Once again, I appreciate being asked. I have always enjoyed sharing this part of our heritage with you. Mr. Dietrich is going to talk to you for a few minutes, and then we're going to move back to the library. We've got a lot of the stuff out that some of it you can handle, some of it you can see up close, and we'd all love to stand around and talk to you, and if we need to get things out of the cabinets and stuff. Tom, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doyle.
Turn me off.
Thank you very much, Doyle. Doyle is truly an asset to this community. I came about archaeology by accident a little over 45 years ago, probably a few years after Doyle got interested in it. My experience was picking up just a piece of ceramics, and I wasn't real knowledgeable. When I was in college, I would admire the Egyptian antiquities that were actually available at the school I went to, and I never thought I'd get to the Mediterranean to have any exciting period of time. But let me tell you, you're living on dirt right now. It is about as precious as any place on earth. They want me to cover about 35 million years in about 10 minutes, and I'm going to go for it. 35 million years ago, this place didn't exist. We were all underwater. There's you don't have any dinosaurs in the state of Florida, although you think you do. But the shore during that particular area is right around Selma, Alabama. That's where you're going to find your first dinosaur bone in North America. But what you did have here, as far as eroding out of the limestone, as he was saying, you had giant shark's teeth. You had shark's teeth that were as much as 7 and 8 inches big. They were from Megalocarcharodon. There was a huge shark that was over 60 feet tall. There's one in the University of Florida, I think, as the entrance to one of the museum buildings, that 6 people can walk hand in hand into the mouth of the shark. That's how big that shark was. Well, they're in the creek less than 3 miles from here. I found them. I also found Carcharodon auriculatus. It's another type of a big shark. But that's not the deal. That in the last 2 million years is what's really exciting about Jackson County. You're in an area that is one of the most precious places on Earth because of the number of springs that you have that are percolating out of the limestone. It's about one of the largest concentrations there is. If you go back to the Ice Age, there's 7 major ice ages in the last 2 million years. Let's go back, say 19,000 years ago, you could go to the pier over in Panama City Beach and you would be looking over that 50 to 80 mile stretch of the continental shelf that would be then exposed. And most of North American animals are going to live there. That's about the only place they've got left to go. Chicago's covered in over 2 miles of ice. You're not going to be there. You're going to be down here along with all the animals. There were pathways open from Asia and Europe over to North America that opened up 7 different times over these last 2 million years. The last time they opened up was maybe about 19,500 years ago. And you didn't just have a little bitty place to walk from Beringia, which is the Bering Sea, from, say, Siberia over to Alaska. It was 160 feet above sea level, and it was 1,000 miles wide. There was plenty of room for you to get from one area to the next. 60% of all the animals that we've got in North America came from the Old World. 40% of the Old World animals came from our world. We had, if you will do the, try that please. Okay, this is a picture. I'm going to try to show you a few artifacts that I did find locally. When I went to this meeting after finding this pottery 45 years ago, I took it to a librarian, and she was the expert. She says, Tom, this 2 million years old, go to an anthropological meeting. Well, I did. About a month later, I come walking up, and I got a Yankee accent 45 years still later, but I walked down up there, and I laid my piece of pottery down, and another fellow walks up and says, well, that's pretty nice. And then he put a rock on the table right next to me. He says, this is an elephant bullet. Okay, I thought I was being joked with a little bit. And I says, what do you mean an elephant bullet? He says, this is a Clovis, a spear tip called a Clovis. It was manufactured maybe as much as 14,000 years ago. And it's like, wow, I had to go Jungle Jim to Africa or Tarzan to India to have any fun as a kid. These things are here. He takes out a box and he lays down a mastodon and a mammoth tooth. And he says, yeah. He says, I got 15 of these in the box. He says, this bullet was used to hunt these animals. And it's like, well, where did you get these? About 6 miles from here, and you can find a creek. Well, a year and a half later, I was the president of that anthropological chapter. Took me 6 years of trying to murder rocks to teach me myself how to make a spear tip. I couldn't do it. I sought out a master flint knapper, and he taught me several generations of knowledge in a matter of a couple months. You can't learn it all on your own. But I want to impress upon everybody here that this land right here, that the Chipola College is on, you're the Chipola Indians, or you're the Chipola elephant hunters. Let me tell you. We had mastodons at a time. The surface of the tooth of that mastodon is rather smooth on the top. He was a grazer. He ate grasses and such. If you'll do the next picture, please. There's a side picture of it, but you can see where this is all smooth along. That guy, it was a grinding service, and he could eat the grasses real easy. He's huge, like an elephant critter. The next picture, please. Well, this is a giant ground sloth's claw. Now, that's a singular claw. The claw, you'll see it over in the other building, but it's about that big. Now, imagine 10 of these in the air, something walking toward you, 20 feet tall. They didn't eat people. They ate trees. But you're still going to pick up the grandkids and run. People like you and I, with the same hearts, with the same minds, and the same reasoning power, confronted these animals right here on your campus. Please go to another picture. This is you see the dollar bill there to give you the size of it? I found a few of these. These are mastodon teeth. Now, they look very similar to mammoths. They're a little bit smaller, but you can see the big, heavy, hard ridges and such. They ate trees. They ate tree limbs. They didn't eat grasses. They didn't compete with the mastodon. They didn't compete with the mammoth. Both of these elephants lived together at the same time right here. And I found bits and pieces of them within hundreds of yards of here, of this building and such. I got 45 years of searching the wonderful things that are just right here in my neighborhood. And this isn't my ancestral neighborhood. I've only been here 45 years, but boy, have I had some fun. Please go to another picture. We had saber-toothed cats right here. They find pieces and parts of these in the Chipola River. Now, these didn't become extinct until probably 11,000 years ago. The mastodon might have become extinct about 6,000, the mammoth maybe 10 and a half, 11 too. But 11,000 years ago, that guy roamed free all around this area. He had a bigger cat called Atrox, which was the American lion. This guy was bigger than the lions in Africa, and Atrox was another 150 pounds bigger than him. Let me give you a for example. How upset do you think grandmas and grandpas and dads got when the wife or the grandmother was saying, there goes another grandkid? You can't stop it, because you couldn't stop these guys from coming on into the camp. There was no possible way. After a few thousand years, you'd probably have an attitude problem. And you'd feel real bad. But about 11,500 years ago, they developed something that he was talking about, the clover spear tip and then the throwing stick as far as the atlatl. The atlatl is a spear that's got a foreshaft on it that detaches. It's got a handle or an extension that's about 18 inches. And it's got a hook in it. I'm going to say, the spear's that way, and I've got my hook going this way. When I pitch it forward, it doesn't just make it go faster. It makes it go not twice as fast, say like 7 times as fast. When it hits the item, it doesn't just hit it like, oh boy, that's really, really fast. It hits with an impact velocity of 200 times greater than if you had just thrown the spear. Bring on these guys. Every major animal that of the Pleistocene became extinct or near extinct within 1,000 years of the development of that. Now, this is something that they figured out over 10,000 years ago. That was enough to get my interest. Please go to another one. That's another picture of that cat. You can see, I mean, these fangs are enormous. They weren't that they chewed with them. There'd be no way to chew with something like that. But they used them as sabers to bring down the other big animals and such, where they'd go for the jugular, let the air out of them, and let them die. Go ahead, please. I tried Doyle did a wonderful job. He's got dozens of each point. These happen to have been found in the local area, and what I was trying to do, the same thing he did. You've got the Clovis at the very top. Then you've got something called a Chipola. And you've got another one called a Mariana. And over here you got one called a Jackson County. Well, of the major cotypes that you find in North America, Jackson County comes up. They even name the spear tips after Jackson County. I think that's pretty special. This rascal right here is the beginning or the end of the arrowhead era. The one over there, all the way up to this point right here, you've still got mastodons. You're talking about basal notch first, slight wasting on the side, major wasting on the side, then you've got corner notching coming in about 7,500 years. Around 5,000 years ago, you have big middle archaic points. 3,500 years ago, you get the basal notch again, all over again. The bow and arrow isn't introduced until right here. That guy right there, they were using an atlatl. I haven't just found a few of these rocks. Over the years, I've found tens of thousands of them. I've been very, very fortunate. He mentioned Calvin Jones, dear Calvin. He brought archaeology into the hands of people like myself and like all of you here, to where I got to teach PhD and master's candidates after about 30 years of messing around with this, and I don't have a degree in it. It's not what you know, but what you pay attention to, believe me. Calvin Jones, he was a mentor to Louis Tesser, and Louis Tesser was a mentor to me. I have been one of the more fortunate rascals around. Is the time getting short? Okay, well, let's go on with this. Right here, this is to talk about something that's special. This is a gorget. It's called technically called a gorget. It's made out of a stone from the Tennessee River Valley, probably made 3,500, 4,000 years ago. I found it right below Bellany Ridge. It's the finest of that artifact found in the world. That's the kind of neat things you got around here. Go to another one. Shark's teeth, camel tooth, pipe, bone pin made of a deer's leg bone, a lock, 1670 to 1725. We had 3 Spanish missions real close to Mariana. This is a particular piece of pottery that you'd have to see a close-up to appreciate it, but it really shows you these people were no fools. They were artistic wizards also. This is a bone pin made from the center of a bisicon shell. Use it as a hairpin. I never needed one. This is one right up here that it's something I didn't find in Mariana, but I found over by Fort Walton Beach. It's a clay ceramic. Oh goodness, my mind's slipping me. Oil lamp. Yes, an oil lamp. You'll find these along the Mediterranean. You can find 500 to 1,500 of them stacked in caves along the Mediterranean, and they're of an era around 2,000 years ago. Well, this one is made of indigenous clays. We've had people, when De Luna came up here, there were, I think, 300 slaves and 500 warriors. There were 500 Mayan warriors that these guys were running loose around here and did get loose. I found a piece over when they made the golf course on the other side of Merritt's Mill Pond. It's a piece of lava rock from Mexico, and I'm the one that picked it up out of the dirt, so I know the authenticity of it. Is there another picture to show? Good, we're done.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes, ma'am.